Hello and welcome to the Two Simple Psychs podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, and with me today is Jason Lutes. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Our topic today is going to be magic and role-playing games. But before we get into that, why don't you tell listeners who you are and what you're about?
My name's Jason Lutes, and I'm kind of like, I got several hats that I wear. All of them, I'm lucky to say, are pretty fun hats. I'm a freelance cartoonist who I've published a number of graphic novels. I published a book called Jar of Fools, and then my current project is a book called Berlin, about Berlin, Germany between the wars. My day job is teaching a 2-year MFA program at a comic book school here in Vermont. So I get to, it's a 2-year program, and every year we get this influx of people who come from all over the country and the world who want to make comic books. And so I get a room full of passionate students who are super excited to do this thing. And it's really fun for me to work with them to help them figure out what they want to say. And then in my spare time, which is usually between the hours of 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., if I'm not... well, I do have a little bit. I have like my wife and I have worked out a block. I have a weekly face-to-face tabletop game night. Like Tuesdays are my night, and from 6:30 to 11:30 with my pals, we play games. And so that's where I put in the hours to really do the really enjoyable thing. And then between 10 and 1 a.m., I'm working on my side projects, which are mostly all RPG related.
So how many days a week do you teach versus like, because I'm sure you have like deadlines or some sort of timeline you need for your Berlin project. So how do you balance that, or what's that like schedule wise?
The biggest balancing thing is you have a kid, right? You have like a 3-year-old. Is that right?
I do. Yeah.
You have 2 kids.
I have a one who just turned 4 last weekend, and then I have a 14-month-old.
Oh my gosh, 14! Wow. All right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I am like, my wife and I share childcare duties, so that's like a big part of it too, right? But I teach right now this coming semester, which starts in a week and a half. I'm just teaching one class. I do other stuff for the school where I work, but I'm just teaching one class, which is kind of the core Comics 101. This is how you tell a story using sequential narrative. So that usually takes half a day of prep as well. So, the day before I'll be working to prep for that. I teach a full day of that. And then once the kids are in school, the rest of the week, which will be Tuesday through Friday, is studio time for me to just work on my book. I have this current project, Berlin, I've been working on for 23 years. As far as deadlines go, I've missed a few. But my current self-imposed deadline is my 50th birthday, which is in December of this year. And that's when the whole book will be done. It's a trilogy, and 2 of the books are in print. And I'm working on the last book of the trilogy right now. And this is more work. This is more studio time than I've had in years. So this is like the final push to get that book out the door.
Cool. Kind of going back a little bit, you said that you have like your weekly game with your buddies. What system are you playing?
Right now, at the moment, we're playing GenLab Alpha, which is based on the Mutant Year Zero system, the Free Illegan. I think they're in Sweden. They did Tales from the Loop, and the most recent thing is Tales from the Loop.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And we switch it up. Every time we start a new campaign, we do one-shot nights. Like if everybody doesn't show up, we'll try out some new thing. But generally, everybody's super interested in ongoing campaigns. So right now, I think we're probably about hopefully 2/3 of the way through GenLab Alpha. I'm not a huge fan of the system. I'm a little annoyed by it, but my players are super into it.
What about that system don't you like?
So one of the things that it borrows a lot from PBTA, but like on a kind of personal level, one of the things that bugs me is it doesn't credit PBTA at all. Which I think, I talked to Vincent about this. I was lucky enough to talk to him in person not too long ago. And I sort of expressed my frustration that there are people that are just like, using all this stuff that he put out into the world. And they're not, and you can't copyright a game mechanic. You can't, and Vincent, in his generosity, didn't even, he was like, here, go, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Take these seeds and do what you will with them. So, obviously there's people like me who are overtly using that material and working with it. And then there's people who kind of clearly took a lot of ideas, but then didn't really. So I'm not talking bad about them now. It's a well-polished, well-written game. It bothers me that credit was not given where credit was due. And when I talked to Vincent about it, he said, well, Ron Edwards was really the first person to really do that. So it's not like it's industry standard. It's not like they're purposely snubbing him. It's just that it's more in the indie game scene that kind of, the page that gives thanks and credits and stuff like that. Sure. So I can let that ride. So once I get over that kind of resentment about their approach, mechanically, I just feel like it's not fully baked, and it's one of these games where, for me, there's this really sweet spot between like a mechanical core that's like a relatively spare structure and just enough kind of narrative hook to give you the freedom to really, improvise within that. And it's a personal thing. It's a matter of taste, right? Like some people love really super crunchy burning wheel approach where every little, it's all carefully crafted. And I love those kinds of mechanics too. But for me, the most enjoyable spot on a week-to-week basis, especially with players who aren't super mechanically minded, are those systems that have kind of a relatively spare mechanical structure, and then, just have things either written right into them like Apocalypse World, or the dungeon world approach of just like a dungeon starter where you just have these impressions that you then build from. And I think the problem with Gen Lab Alpha for me is that it goes pretty heavily mechanical, and it goes pretty traditional in the sense that it tries to explain everything about the setting in the world, but then it doesn't go far enough in some areas. And it makes me feel like it wasn't really well play tested, because there are areas that seem like should have really obviously been addressed. Whereas there'll be weird details about things which seem kind of ancillary or not important, and then there'll be things which, in our experience, have been a big part of the play which just aren't even touched on. So, and maybe it's just purely my personal play group culture, and we're not pushing the right buttons.
Are you running the game, or are you a player?
I'm always running.
I know everyone I talk to, I think just about, if not at least running a game and playing games, they're like GMs only. And that seems to be almost everyone I've taught, and myself included. I almost exclusively, I can't tell you the last time I even played a game where I wasn't running it. But do you feel, especially when you're playing a system, a new system or a system that's not yours, it's hard for you to take off that kind of creator hat?
Yeah. A lot of my aggravation or annoyance has to do with this is so badly written in this. You know what I mean? I'm totally crapping on this game, but that's not fair. A lot of people put a lot of work and effort. The art is beautiful. The layout is beautiful. But everybody has their things that they like and don't like about these games. And I had exactly that reaction to a lot of stuff I read. And then maybe that's also why I like this a more spare narrative, a more suggestive thing, because then it gives me the room to just put in my own idea of what would be best. But when things are really sort of fully written out, you either it's pretty easy as a creative person who, fancies themselves a decent writer, to get annoyed or to just be like, oh, this is bad. And then of course you can just work around it. You can make up your own stuff and make it better. But
right,
when that core is just kind of not there, it can be hard.
Yeah, I find the more systems I look at, in kind of looking at rule sets and playing in different games, and I run games with my son who's 4. I run games with people who are high school or older. I run them in therapeutic settings and all these sort of things. And what I find I value most out of all the systems I play is elegance in design, and exactly what you're saying, where it's I want you to send the most message, or the most defined message possible with the least amount of words. If you are going to have a lot of words, I think that tends to allow a lot of bloating in systems. And what's the joke when it comes to 3.5 or old school D&D? It's no hero ever failed to ride a horse until you put a rule to it. Yes, it's totally the case, right? It's there's no why have somebody fail to ride a horse if it's not really progressing storylines and all that sort of stuff. And so but the other end is I've run games with high school kids who see that it's light rules, and they just crash a game into the ground because, you know, they say, oh, well, there wasn't a rule that says I couldn't do this. So I did this thing, and you're like, you know, so if everyone's not on that same page, in accordance with where that rule, where the rules want to be elegant, then yeah, you can have that kind of dissonance there. But are you playing video games, or are there any like Kickstarter program or Kickstarters coming up, or movies or comics?
I should say that. So I'm eager to wrap up this Gen Lab Alpha game and then get into a Blades in the Dark campaign. That's our next.
Yeah,
I've been jonesing for that. So that's our next plan. As far as other stuff goes, I've been playing like sort of video games. I'm playing less of them now because of the time. You know, that I need to. You know, I like games where like you can get a lot done in a short amount of time. You know, and I'm a big. I think my sort of main thing is turn-based strategy stuff. But I'm looking forward to the XCOM 2 expansion called War of the Chosen, because that game is pretty incredible. And weirdly, I'm kind of looking forward to the Total Warhammer 2, which is it's basically sort of an RTS with a turn-based strategic overlayer. And generally, that stuff is not. I don't have the patience for it. But this one, in terms of the sheer detail, you know, I kind of have a fondness for the Warhammer world. Mm-hmm. I never did the miniature thing. I played like Warhammer role playing for a while. But I have a fondness for just like the insane gothic baroque richness to all that, and seeing it realized in this video game is just kind of mind blowing. The degree of detail and you know, all the stuff in terms of the lore I don't really care about, but like it's just extraordinary to like look at. Sure. and kind of play around with. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. As far as, you know, but my real passion, my real love is tabletop stuff, and face-to-face, you know, the social experience of being at the table with people playing. And I have so many, we're in such a kind of golden age of indie RPGs. Yeah. I think due in no small part to Vincent and PBTA. That's, you know, a big section of the indie game thing is that. And then, of course, there's all these other incredible games coming out every day. And I've got shelves full and then you end up having to prioritize. I want to buy and support all of them. Yeah. And then you're like, okay, but I've only got my 4 or 5 hour slot every week. What are we going to play? Like, that's my time. So it feels precious, but it doesn't stop me from just buying anything that looks good. And the things I'm looking forward to currently are, I think the thing I'm most looking forward to is The King is Dead, which is Vincent's next game. I think he's gonna put out, which is kind of a retooling of Firebrands, which is this really cool anime mecha RPG that's a series of mini games that you play. There's no GM. You kind of go around the table and people choose. Everybody has a little book, and when it's your turn, you choose a mini game from the book to play with the other characters. Oh, that's cool. It's a really cool, totally novel kind of approach, and he's taking that idea and applying it to a more kind of Game of Thronesy situation. So I'm just super looking forward to that. I was lucky enough this summer to have I got married and I had a bachelor party, and my friends surprised me by having Vincent and Meg show up at my bachelor party. Oh, wow, that's awesome. Which was insane. I mean, I'm not somebody who like has a lot of idols in my life, and I was just totally unprepared for them to come walking through the door, and they had Firebrands with them, so we all sat down and we got to play Firebrands. Oh, that's cool. Which was like the best bachelor party. I know. Imagine. Yeah, the idea of like a bachelor party, what I would want to do, or like even on my birthdays, like what I want to do on my birthday is get all of my wife's family and anyone who's like around me to let me run a game for them. Like that's what I want to do. Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think that says a lot about who we are as in the community and as gamers and stuff. So yeah, no, we're not gonna have any strippers and Jack Daniels. We're gonna RPGs. That's right. The approach. Right. So I'm looking forward to that. And the other ones I think I had on my list after I looked at the interview questions. Mm-hmm. I was like, whatever John Harper does next. But now I know one of the things he's doing next is Agon, the second edition of Agon, with Jason Morningstar kind of helping him out. So I'm looking forward to that. And The Watch, which is Andrew Medeiros' PBTA thing, which I think is supposed to come out in October. And that's one I think would be really easy for my group to get into. And also, one of the things that's really fun for me as a teacher at this school is I get all these, generally people in their 20s, 30s coming in. They're all comic book nerds. 90% of them are comic book nerds. And, there's a big overlap between comic book nerds and RPG stuff, or at least people who are interested or never got a chance to play RPGs but have always been curious. So I have this amazing pool every year of students who are kind of either willing to play or curious, and I get to introduce them to games. And in fact, I use Fiasco in the classroom sometimes.
Oh, cool.
So the Watch is a game that I think would be perfect for that. Bring in some total new blood for a one-off night or whatever, and the way it seems set up would be really amenable to that.
Have you? I think I talked about this on a different podcast, but have you seen what is it called? Poutine.
No.
Do you know what poutine is?
I just ate some a little while ago. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. I guess there's forgive me for not remembering who made it, but there's a role-playing game called Poutine, wherein you just are working at this restaurant, and like the main gimmick is they sell poutine, right? But the whole game is if you are the server, you're like the GM for that round, and the other players are patrons who come in and are going to eat dinner. But those people have you have to facilitate their conversation as the server. And then based on how well you did, they give you tips, and that's kind of like your experience or success points. But the whole game is predicated on you need to be a good server, and we're all just working in this kind of low franchise restaurant that sells poutine. I don't know. It's really interesting. So,
are you talking about a pen and paper RPG?
Yeah, it's a tabletop.
Not a video game. Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, it looks cool. So anyways, so kind of let's move towards talking more about some of your current projects, and talk about some of your comics and some of your other RPG things before we head into the main topic. Is there so I know you're working on Berlin. Is there anything new that's coming up that you're working on?
That's it. That's all as far as comics go, as soon as I get that done, then I'll have time to think about. I have a list of all the things I want to do, but right now all of my studio time is being taken up with that book. In fact, I had to put my RPG stuff kind of on the back burner until the end of the year. So that I'm not going to be able to do any new RPG stuff until January, probably.
Okay.
At which point, so 2018, I hope to put out both Stonetop, which is Jeremy Strandberg's campaign setting for Dungeon World, which I'm super excited about, and he's been working hard on for a long time. And that'll be our first project that we're going to do next year. And then hopefully sometime in the second half of that year, I'll be able to put out a second edition of Freebooters on the Frontier, which will be self-contained, totally its own thing. So you won't need Dungeon World or anything else. It'll be its own.
Oh, wow. Interesting. That's great. So kind of going back a little bit, I want to talk about the role-playing half and a little moving forward. But I saw on the Wall Street Journal, they posted a video discussing you and Berlin, and I think it's a couple of years old, but I just kind of wanted to ask you, looking at that, and you kind of talk about your process of how you make comics, how much research did you have to do when you were creating Berlin?
I did about 2 years of just research before I drew the first page. I was finishing up the book that I did before that, and I had this crazy idea that I was going to do a comic book about Berlin that was going to be 600 pages long, really not knowing anything about Berlin in the 20s and 30s. It was just this impulsive idea, and I'm a person who has an impulse and then follows it through to the bitter end. Usually I kind of get blinders on when it comes to following those things, which it served me well. It's taken me a very, very long time, but I'm super happy with the results, and I've managed to eke out a career in the meantime, which is great. So I did 2 years of research, and this is sort of pre-internet. So it was going to use bookstores and university libraries, and just gathering up all the material I could. I'm looking at a bookshelf here next to me that's half full of a lot of books I bought back then. And then I just tried to really, I have I found an old map of the city from 1928, and I put that up on my wall, and I just read and read and read. And the rule I set for myself was I didn't want to read anything that happened after 1933. I didn't want to read any history or primary sources that were written after that point. So I read as much stuff from the era as possible, and then I read histories of the era, and just tried to, I just drew a line at 1933, which is when Hitler becomes chancellor. Because the goal was, the question was, how did everything that happened happen? How did the Holocaust happen? How did World War II happen? It was a self-education, because I had a poor public high school education, followed by art school. So there was a point at which I realized that there's this huge hole in my understanding of history. So in retrospect, I realized, this is the impulse thing. I'll have an impulse and I'll follow, and I don't know why I have the impulse. But then, 5 years into the project, I was like, oh, this is what I'm doing. Like, I'm trying to figure out
sure
why that stuff happened myself. So after 2 years, I felt like I kind of had a sense and I was in Seattle, Washington at the time. So I was on the west coast of the United States and imagining what Berlin, Germany was like in 1928, which was a totally interesting process. The whole project has been super interesting for me as it's almost like I feel like I'm in like a submersible, I build this thing and then I go into the depths. And that's what happens when I go into my studio, is I go back into that, the past, and, the characters are largely fictional. There's a couple of actual real people show up in the story, but it's a cast of characters from different sort of strata of society, and it's just sort of follows their lives and what happens to them.
Yeah, looking at the reviews and everything I've read online about Berlin, it seems that in large part the story is much more about kind of like, I don't want to say mundane or like suburbia kind. Yeah,
that's fair. Yeah,
that sounds like a pejorative, but yeah, I mean, it's about like just regular people's lives and how that could be interesting in this kind of circumstance. To me, that sounds like you're really flexing your dungeon master
Indeed.
muscles there, right? So how much do you think your gaming background really shaped that narrative and had to make that kind of mundane stuff interesting?
I'm going to say 95%. It's huge. I mean, games were my first, I drew comics before I started playing, so I loved comics as a kid. I remember I would copy copies of the pages of the Avengers, and my mom would letter them for me before I could write, right? So I was drawing comics from a very early age. And I didn't discover D&D until 1978. So I was like 10, 11 years old. And of course it blew my mind, and I couldn't get enough of it. And the way that it catalyzed my creativity, once I crossed that line, it was like I couldn't go back. Once I became a dungeon master for all my friends, as there appears to be certain personalities that take on that role, and other people who want nothing to do with it. They want to just play the character. I completely took to it, and because that was a big part of my kind of leisure time that I spent as a kid. I think the most formative time was when it was in suburban California. It was in the South Bay area, in totally like the kind of suburbs where like you get lost because everything looks exactly the same. And I'd come from the backwoods of Montana, so I felt completely lost and in this weird kind of wasteland of concrete and shopping malls. And D&D was like my salvation. D&D was like the way that I could escape into this world of imagination with my pals. Was huge. So and so the world building and the playing of NPCs and the inhabiting other, all of that has been not just in the comics, it's in the teaching too, right? Like, so completely informed my comics making, because like you said, like I imagine what the lives of these, basically they're the NPCs on the street that really get into that and really empathize and really try to understand where they're coming from, what their backgrounds are, how they would interact with each other. You really try to, I think what I realized, another thing besides the whole self-education part, was like, it was a project in getting out of myself, right? Not just into other characters, but to another time and place. So it was really, that was a huge part of the effort, was in that kind of really trying to get out of my own experience and put myself there as other people. You know, and empathizing, I try to empathize with everybody from, you know, working class mother to a guy who becomes a Nazi, to whose husband joins the National Socialist Party. Like, why? You know, what's going on there? So yeah, the gaming stuff was huge. And then in the classroom, it comes into play. I think I'm one of the, I think with the Joe Banner interview that you did, you mentioned how as a GM, you look around the table and you want to make sure everybody's having a good time. Like if you notice somebody staring off into space or whatever, you're kind of sensitive to that, and you want to just make sure, let's shift the spotlight over there, or what's not working, right? Like what am I doing right now when I'm in the classroom and I've got 20 people? And I think I'm probably too sensitive to it because of the Dungeon Master GM experience. When you've got a table of 5 people, one person looking out, you know, staring off into space can be addressed.
Right.
In a room with 20 people, you don't want to like somehow tailor that experience to that one person you see doing that. But certainly like the awareness you need to have as a GM, I mean, a good GM, I know there's plenty of bad GMs out there, but what I learned anyway, because like I wanted to be liked as the GM, and the way to get liked is to like make sure everybody's having a good time, right? You got to be a good host.
Right.
And that completely affected my approach to the classroom as well.
Cool. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about Berlin. I want to move us forward, but I watched another video by, I hadn't heard of these guys before, but on YouTube, they're called Throwback Thursday, and they did a review of Berlin. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said here, but he said something like, you know how it's going to end, but you still feel that the characters have a chance. Did you explicitly like try to instill that hope of like, maybe as you're reading it, that there is still that piece that like maybe things will, I know you're still working on like kind of in that realm of that project, but like part of it where the reader isn't really aware, is it going to end exactly like history says it is? Is it going to be like sort of like a historical fiction where maybe things you know, like how much of that did you think?
Alternate time, like, maybe somebody kills Hitler at the end. Right. Well, I'll tell you, nobody kills Hitler at the end. Yeah, I think that just comes out, that just comes out of what I described about my research process. I think if I'm really there and I'm really imagining and I don't know the future, then this is how I'm going to act as these characters on the street. And if they're acting that way, then they have hope. They don't imagine what's coming down the road. So I think that ideally that does carry over to the reader's experience, you know. And I think that's part of the nature of storytelling, right? Like there's plenty of stories that we consume, absorb, that have that similar quality of like, you kind of know how it's all going to end, but it's like you want to root for whoever's there to put your hope in, and it's really the kind of, you know, the journey that becomes the most interesting part.
Cool. You know, looking at your art style, kind of moving more towards that, what's your thoughts, or how do you what's your philosophy with like noir style, or just like black and white and negative space, and kind of, I know this is probably a big question for you. You can probably talk about it a lot, but that's like one of my favorite art styles, right? Like I love the idea of being able to like try to tell a story with the least amount of material, and what kind of story can you tell by what you're not telling, and that kind of stuff. So kind of what's your thoughts on that? Yeah,
so that ties back to what we were saying about RPG rules writing, right? And creating this kind of elegant or spare structure that implies or makes room for people to fill in the gaps and create kind of a richness. It's really, really great that that's something that caught your attention, because it's super important to me. Black and white art, you know, a lot of people say, well, why is it in color? It's more interesting and attractive if it's in color, right? The same argument that was made when film transitioned from black and white to color. And for me, on a comics page, because it's ink on paper, if it's just black ink on white paper, there's like a kind of open, it's kind of a bare bones honesty going on there. I'm not trying to And also, it still is just black ink on white paper. There's something really super basic about that. When you start adding color, and also, I guess, okay, you're right. I have too much to say about this, and I'm not going to go too far. But I'll
give you 3 minutes. You say whatever you want. 3 minutes. Go for it.
In the space between things is where we as readers and participating individuals, the spaces that we are allowed to fill in, that we're invited to fill in, right, in interactive media. Those open spaces are the places where things really come alive. When I am reading a thing and I'm reading between the lines, either literally or figuratively. In comics, it would be literally, right? There's the break between the panels. That's a gap. And when you have a panel that you read and then you move to the next panel, you as the reader have to close that gap internally with your mind, with your imagination. So it's like you're inviting the reader to make some decisions or come to some conclusions or jump across those gaps on their own creative, imaginative power. And when you engage a reader that way, they become that much more kind of enmeshed in your thing. And it's the same thing in an RPG. If you say, when you say, this is the situation, what do you do, right? To get to that next part of the story, you have to imagine the possibilities and choose one. And I think comics are a medium that, you could say, two paintings on the wall can have a similar effect, right? Or we can draw associations between objects we see on the street. With comics, it's a kind of built-in aspect of the medium that I try to take advantage of as much as possible. And for me, the black and white art, the simpler it is, the more room there is for the imagination to come into play, right? If it's all colored in, then if you know the colors, that it's a simple thing, right? But you're filling in, you're coloring in the coloring book for the person reading it, as opposed to allowing them to do that. But it's happening, and I'm not. That's like a sort of objective level. What color is this coffee cup or whatever? But like at a narrative level, it's where it's most powerful and most exciting, because then there's room for the suggestion and the nuance and the subtlety and the real, what I consider the kind of engine that drives a great narrative is not what the writer did. It's what the writer sets up for you to make happen. And that's a big part of what I try to do when I'm writing my own stuff.
So kind of building off that, especially, if I'm trying to marry like the discussion between like visual art and like role playing, I think that especially when it comes to like trad games versus indie games versus story games, there is this idea that more rules leads to like a richer play experience, right? And to me, that's right. Like you're almost like you're sacrificing more game or richness if you don't have a rule for everything, right? But the same thing, I think I didn't realize that until we just had this conversation about why I love noir so much, is that it's actually more freeing to have a black and white minimal frame than it is to have every single detail and every single color. That leaves no room for interpretation, no room for the person who's looking and digesting whatever the art is, whether it's RPGs or pictures. That leaves no room for them to be active, right? Like if you see a coffee mug and it's white on a black and white whatever, it in the context of that, it could really be any color, right? Or if there's no background, like if somebody put too much detail.
Yes, that's huge, right.
Yeah, it could be anything, and you're really sending the message of how important is the background? Is it more of like you're supposed to infer what the background is? Where do you really want to put the perception of eyes in that frame by how much you don't put in there? So it's really enlightening to hear you talk about that from the RPG standpoint and as the artist. So
yeah,
awesome.
Sometimes I'll start a scene and I'll have the first panel will have the background of the room or whatever, and then for the rest of the panels I'll drop it. So like you set it up in the reader's mind's eye, this is the room, and then they don't even notice that it's not there anymore because it's in their head, and then the character kind of going within it. That's an example of how it has like a really practical application.
Cool. So before I move on to more of the role playing part, I gotta ask, how was it working with Ed Brubaker on The Fall?
It was great. That's a good friend of mine. We go the sort of dawn of our respective careers in comics were directly intertwined. He broke up, his girlfriend in San Francisco broke up with him, and he moved to Seattle, and we slept in the same bed for 2 weeks. When we were both sort of poor, starving artists, and he didn't have an apartment yet. And that was before. I mean, he was doing his own little. Used to draw his own comics back in the day. He did a comic called Low Life. This is in the early '90s, and we only knew each other through the mail. Like, he came to Seattle, and we're like cartoonists. We both, we have goatees and glasses. We're like the same tribe. Sure. And then, he just like worked his ass off and built an amazing career for himself. It's just been totally incredible to watch him take off. And like, he had this guy who I knew as a starving artist in Seattle ended up having like a cameo with Robert Redford in like the Captain America movie. It was
right.
Like the most absurd, surreal thing to see him in that movie. And working on The Fall was fantastic because he's really great at writing these kind of noir stories. We set it in Seattle, which is where we were living, so I got to like go out into the neighborhood and draw things from life. We got to choose, it was like we were making a movie. We're like, where's this scene gonna happen? We'd go find the place, and we'd set it in this coffee shop or on this rooftop or whatever.
And this was in the 90s?
This was, 96 maybe, might have been when that came out. And it was, I love collaborating with people that understand comics. And Ed is somebody who, because he was writing and drawing his own stuff together, so he understood the visual part. So working with him was a great pleasure because he understood when to give me creative power to like say, I don't know how to stage this scene. What do you got? And then there's other parts we had really clear visual ideas about what he wanted to do. So it was great. And there was back and forth. It was like, once I got the dialogue down, I'd go back to him and say like, hey, I think the way these lines are lining up on the page, this doesn't feel right. Let's rewrite this. And so it was a super fun project. Hopefully one day it'll be back in print, but it's been out of print for a long time, which is too bad.
So I live in Spokane, so I'm in Washington State right now.
Oh, awesome.
So this was like 96, and you guys were in Seattle. Between the two of you guys, how many flannels do you guys think you owned?
Ed and I purposely, we weren't anti-grunge, but we did not, engage in that aspect of fashion.
How long was your guys' hair?
They're quite short. No, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm a Nirvana fan. And I like some of that stuff, but I'm a huge Nirvana fan. But didn't really, if we had like a kind of fashion subculture we were part of, it would have been the kind of nerdy alternative comics scene, which was kind of rooted around Fantagraphics, which had like a vague overlap with like punk rocky type stuff, but not, we just looked like average white guys in Seattle. We didn't we did not fit the grunge stereotype in.
Okay.
For better or for worse, maybe we could have gotten some more action if we'd done that.
Looking at like on Drive Through RPG and looking at all the projects you've worked on, why create so much for Dungeon World versus like trad games or anything else? What about Dungeon World caught you?
Great question. So I grew up playing RPGs. White box D&D was the gateway, and then sort of followed D&D as it evolved. Played a whole bunch of games in the 80s, different kinds of games. Sort of fell out of it. Went to art school. Took me a while to get back into games. Came to teach at the school where I teach now. And some people expressed interest in playing D&D because they never had. So I dredged up some AD&D books, and we tried to play Steading of the Hill Giant Chief. It was fun, but it was, interest was lost. And then somebody else, another group of students was like, hey, I've never done it either. I'd like to give it a try. I was like, okay. And I was like, well, what's the newest version of D&D? Because I had been out of it for a while. And it was Pathfinder. It was 3.5 Pathfinder, right? So I was like, okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do Pathfinder. So, and I bought the Kingmaker Adventure, whatever they call it, Adventure Path, I think, right? It's like a campaign. because it sounded cool. It was kind of hex crawly a little bit, which goes back to my roots. And we had a lot of fun for a while. And then it got to the point, which I think you mentioned earlier, where there was a rule for everything. And it started to drive me insane because, like, I felt like I'm a little OCD, like most cartoonists are OCD. We put things in little boxes for a living. So, like, it's just part of the territory. So the idea that, like, we'd be doing something, some whatever, and I'd think to myself, there's probably a rule for this. And if I kind of felt like I had to find that rule, right? Like I had to know, I had to make sure we were doing it right. We had to make sure we were doing it as the rules were written. And, you know, people were getting on their phones and checking the SRD online. And it was just like, this is not what I want. I don't want to be doing this. It's such a drag. You know, we had a wonderful time up until, I don't know, we probably got like halfway through that adventure path. And then I was like, you guys, I kept it to myself. I was like, they're having fun. We're going to keep doing this. And then we had like a session that was like 4 hours and it was one battle with some trolls. It was an epic battle, but it was like 4 hours of game time. And at the end of that, I was like, oh God. And then we had played Fiasco on like an off night. And then somebody had mentioned Dungeon World to me. And then for some reason, instead of Dungeon World, I got Adventures on Dungeon Planet first. Oh, well, because Dungeon World was out of print at that point, and I really wanted the book. But Adventures on Dungeon Planet was in print, print on demand, John Stone Metzger's kind of pulp sci-fi Dungeon World thing. So I ordered that, and we played that, and it was awesome. It was like exactly like what I wanted, and like in so many ways, it like hit all. What it did was it brought me back, as so many people have said, to when I was 10, and you can make shit up. There were rules. There was enough of a structure there, but there was enough of that space. There was enough of that fruitful void, that room where you could make stuff up. I remember specifically there was a character who had on his equipment list, it said he had a magic shield. And that was it. There's other equipment, but like as far as magic shield goes, and I would like look through the book, look in the index. I was like, well, what does this magic shield do? And then at a certain point, I realized we were playing the game, and I started him off in some kind of in media res, difficult situation where they're going to be sacrificed to some monster. And then he's like, and I was like, so you got your magic shield? What does it look like? And he describes it to me. And then I'm like, okay, what does it do? and then he's like, well, I guess you can throw it and it comes back to you. No matter where you are, it'll come back to you. And I'm like, awesome. Like that's what it does. And then that moment to me crystallized, and there was just a super fun, once that kind of precedent was set and all the other players saw that, every time I asked them a question, they wouldn't try to game it. They would just try to give a genuine and entertaining and fun and in-character response. And it was just pure joy. It was just like all the wheels fell off, and we were just like rolling down a hill in a broken shopping cart and having the time of our lives. And that's a horrible analogy, by the way. I don't know why I came up with that, but I don't know why Pathfinder is a shopping cart with wheels that work. And so what I did was like, well, this Pathfinder campaign was unresolved, so I got the PDF of Dungeon World, and I converted our Pathfinder campaign to Dungeon World. So that was a great experience because I came to grips with the mechanics directly. How do I make this game make sense in this game? How do I take this crazy sorcerer gnome and make him a Dungeon World character? And then we lasted probably 3 or 4 more sessions. It was better, but the steam had already gone out of this campaign, and it died, thankfully. And then because that had just like the fire of inspiration were just like, I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited by this. This is like so inspiring and so, the sense of possibility, right? There's this sense of like, what is possible? All these things are suggested, all these directions are pointed in, and we can go in any one of them. And I think in like a 3-day period, I wrote this adventure called Servants of the Cinder Queen. Because I was like, what does an old module look like in Dungeon World? There's dungeon starters and there's fronts and stuff like that. And but I was really curious about like, well, what would happen if you took the idea of a more fleshed out adventure module and kind of tried to bring it in and keep the openness of Dungeon World? So I wrote this adventure in kind of a mad rush and then kickstarted it. And And then from there, you know, it was just like one thing after another.
Awesome. But okay, but I think I had a very similar experience as far as like the enlightenment of PBTA or Dungeon World, where I think it's on the Bard sheet. It says something like when you weave a magic spell into a performance, you do one of these 6 things or whatever. And I remember reading it and I was like, yeah, but how do I do that? And I looked through the rules again. I'm like, no, but like, and then I went into like Control F on the PDF and was like, I can't find how to weave a performance. Like, is that but I was so thinking about like these old, you know, the leftovers of these trad games where it's like, I can't find the bold text that says weave a performance does X, right? And then it's like, once you finally wrap your head around that, then you're like this, I think what you said was the fruitful void. That's like the best way to describe that space that we're talking about, where like less rules fill in the gaps with this fruitful void where you can then make the game which you want.
Yeah.
So awesome. But, you know, looking at all the products that you've made and even just looking at the name, I want to ask where the name Lampblack and Brimstone come from. But before you answer, I have a guess.
Okay.
Is it your cat?
I wish. My kids name their cats. They don't know what Lampblack or Brimstone is. Well, they probably know what Brimstone is because it smells like farts. So they probably know. But yeah, no. You know what Lampblack is?
No.
Okay, so I do this lecture every year where I talk to the students about ink and where it comes from and paper and stuff like that, because we use traditional tools before they can. A lot of them come in with digital. We teach them traditional, and then they can go back to digital, but they have to learn the old ways. One way of making ink was to scrape the carbon that accretes on the inside of a kerosene lamp or an oil lamp, right? The black matter that accumulates is called lampblack. So you would scrape that off and you'd mix it, you'd powder it and mix it with oil and other stuff to make ink. And I just loved the word lampblack. And I think, there's not like some cool origin story. It was 2 words that I thought sounded good together and kind of evoked. There's the whole black and white aesthetic that you're talking about. Like all of my stuff is black and white. Like the art's black and white. The colors are, they're usually sort of a parchmenty kind of trying to evoke old paper kind of thing. So it was. I just wanted an evocative title that sounded good. And Brimstone has this kind of occult, magical implication. So I just wanted those 2 things. They sounded good together. They had the vibe of the kind of stuff I wanted to make. It's like choosing a band name, I guess, right? Like I can do a certain amount of material within this umbrella,
right?
That I've sort of set out for myself.
Okay. I think the reason why I thought it was your cat was in like the NPC folio. I think the cat's name is like Lampblack or something, right?
Oh, yeah, that may be the case. I think that might have been Jeremy Strandberg wrote all those NPCs.
Oh, okay. Because I just figured that maybe that was like an homage, just like a cute little thing of like, oh, well, this is my cat. And all right. So the last question I want to ask you before we move on to the psychology segment and talking about magic and games. Philosophically, what did you want to accomplish when you created Freebooters?
I think it was like, so played Dungeon World, loved it, really. I mean, introduced a lot of people to it. Such a great game to pull out and play on a moment's notice, as long as you have the playbooks printed up. And then I think I also really had enjoyed. I gotten back into the whole hex crawl approaches to hex crawls. Like I read the stuff online. It's really interesting being this age that I'm at, and relative to when I discovered the game, and other generally men, my age who are having, I've had similar experiences, and the OSR is connected to this. Like, let's recreate that feeling we had when we were, there's that. I think it has to do with. I think Walter Murch, the film editor, said like when you're 12 years old, whatever was inspiring you when you were 12 years old is going to end up coming back, like, and be this big deal in your life. And for him, it was film. So, you see my generation coming back and like, writing all these things that kind of try to get back to those earliest feelings. And I think because Dungeon World and Adventures on Dungeon Planet, like, got those same fires going for literally the first time in 30 years, I wanted to kind of, World of Dungeons kind of has that kind of reverse engineer. Here's what Dungeon World, the kind of joke that World of Dungeons is where Dungeon World came from. This is John Harper's kind of very minimalist hack of Dungeon World. I wanted to like take the move structure, the PBTA structure, and get a little more towards the kind of, or not a little more towards, I really wanted to go back to the kind of nitty gritty. Magic users have 1d4 hit points. The early levels are really hard to survive. I should say that around the same time that the Pathfinder game was wrapping up, we were also playing DCC RPG. And that the way that has this total madcap gonzo take on that stuff also was really inspiring at the time. So I wanted to take, and in fact, DCC really influenced Freebooters a lot. So it's a combination of the way DCC handles some stuff, my memories of specifically the old Judges Guild stuff that came out in the 70s that we were playing in 1978, 1979. And the way that there would be these wilderness maps, and you could go, and then there'd be the guidebook to what's in each hex, but it would just be like a sentence, So there's so much room to like figure out what the heck that meant, and exploring that map was just like super, super fun. So I wanted to go back to this feeling of like almost like survival horror, right? Like, here's your weakling character who's who you really just rolled the dice right down the line, and this is what you got to work with. Let's see if you can survive. Let's see if you can survive to level 2. There's an aspect of that which I just really, really enjoy. Like, I really enjoy what the stakes are. I really enjoy when players feel really desperate for their characters to survive. On the one hand, the more kind of dramatic, more adventure movie approach to Dungeon World is obviously really, really great in its own right, and it's an amazing take on the fantasy adventure genre and stuff like that. But there's this thing that's really particular to D&D, early edition D&D, which is this survival game where you're just trying to like get by. And then when you do survive, when you've rolled up your 6th or 7th character and gotten to level 3 or whatever, like the satisfaction, like there's the satisfaction that comes from every little problem you face in solving it, and then there's the bigger overarching satisfaction of getting further in the world and getting further, put some money, putting some gold pieces in the bank account and buying a horse. Mm-hmm. That kind of satisfaction I just really enjoy a lot, and not as a cruel GM like let's make the players die, but I enjoy the sense of accomplishment that comes from them succeeding.
Yeah, when we look at when we look at Funnel World, right, and like the starters for that, they definitely have that like dramatic kind of like there is a pressing, like there's dogs, like big dog men like coming towards you and like trying to get through the door. How are you going to survive this, right? It's not like, oh, you wake up at a tavern and you guys are going to go off, and like the action comes straight to you in a very horrific way. And so like it makes it that much funner when it's like, oh man, the one character that I rolled up that had a sword and that was good, that dude just died. But the one who survived was this lady who doesn't even have enough strength to even carry her bag of flour around. Like that, yeah, that kind of gonzo kind of Dungeon Crawl Classics kind of feel. Yeah, I think that definitely comes through when we look at that. The last thing I want to ask you just real quick on this is when we look at like Funnel World and then we look at like Freebooters, and it's like if they when you look at your products, if they survive Funnel World, did you like kind of purposely like kind of have it flow into then you can make like actual meaningful like full fleshed out characters with Freebooters, or was that like not anything that you imagined?
Well, that's the kind of when I wrote Funnel World, it was a stretch goal for that event, the Servants of the Cinder Queen, because I loved the DCC funnel experience and I wanted to see what that looked like in Dungeon World. And Freebooters wasn't even in my mind at that point. It was like, what does a funnel look like? And then I had like a little thing about how once your funnel characters survive, you can turn them into Dungeon World characters, which is kind of too much of a jump there from these hard scrabble villagers who then become the other guys. So Freebooters is an attempt to create a closer a bridge there, but it's also, it doesn't mesh as well as I would like. And I think that one of the goals for the second edition for me is to have it be a kind of soup to nuts. If you want to, you can either start first level or you can start 0 level and do a funnel and then use those characters. So it's going to be more integrated next time around. So that was not a conscious, I mean, it's a pretty clumsy connection right now. And one thing I want to do is actually make it really a smoother integrated transition.
All right. So our topic today is going to be magic in role-playing games. And so I just want to ask, in your terms, like in RPG terms, what is magic?
Wow. I think it's like this direct connection to the fantasy part of the fantasy world, right? Like when you think about the 4 basic kind of original classes, fighter, thief, cleric, magic user. I mean, the cleric's got the connection to the divine, but the magic user is the one who's working with, the implication is that the magic is happening there, right? Like the magic user is either conjuring it into existence or, it's so bare bones in the original that like, who knows where the magic's coming from? There's no real explanation. It's just magic. So I think it's like this, there's this real direct connection for the PC who has access to that ties into the idea that you're in this fantastical world, right? You can manipulate these strange forces and powers. And I mean, it's funny to think about the evolution of that because it really does come primarily, I feel like it starts with the characters when you go back to the wargaming roots. And they decided to incorporate these characters who were wizards. It clearly comes from all the fiction that they were reading, right? That Gygax and Arneson and all those guys were reading. There's this desire to have these guys in there who could throw lightning bolts and fireballs. So there's this kind of character first thing that's there in the very beginning. And then I think later on that sort of extrapolates out and then, what does it mean if magic's actually part of the world? And the magic users can make things like magic items and, so, but for me, I think there is this. It's I always associate with the kind of the wizards are the crazy people. The wizards are or a nicer way to put it, but they're the ones who are in touch with the like darker aspects of the laws of nature or physics or whatever.
The supernatural.
Yeah, the supernatural, the manipulation of reality in these ways that are perhaps not healthy. So there is a kind of dark aspect to them. It's at least implied, right? The thief's kind of dark. It's a thief, for crying out loud. Like one of the core classes is just a thief.
Sure. So I did a little bit of research, and you typically when I do these interviews, I want to do some like empirical data, with some sort of research that people could look up. But really with magic, it was all kind of this philosophical kind of discussion. And if you type in history of magic, the only thing that shows up on Google is a bunch of Harry Potter stuff. So, but one of the things I did look up was a man named Sir James George Fraiser, who lived from 1854 to 1941, and he was a social anthropologist. And kind of what he suggested was, and now this is archaic, but that human belief develops in 3 stages. If we look kind of more in like anthropological progression, that it's primitive magic, then that gets replaced by religion, and then that turns into science, right? And we can think anecdotally about how that's happened, as far as the world being flat and distance from the sun, and are we the center of the universe, and what makes the sun come up, and like all these kind of things. But what I think is interesting there is that there's this progression of like, we can say the thing is magic, and we can loosely define what magic is. It's just, it's the link to the supernatural that causes this thing to happen, right? But then if that grows into, like, if that replaces religion is just like the mechanized way of controlling the supernatural, right? You have to pray, you have to pay alms to this thing, and that's how you control, you have any sort of semblance over control over magic, and then that turns into science. Well, if we can continually produce the same result, it kind of loses that magic feel and it becomes science. I think in certain ways, when we look at how we mechanize magic in role-playing games, it has kind of turned into a science, right? When we look at a spell in like a trad game, Magic Missile always deals 1d4 plus 1 times 3 or whatever it is, right? There's no shaping, there's no question. It's like you roll your thing, it either happens exactly the way you want it to or it doesn't. So leading to the next question, philosophically or mechanically, what is your view of what good magic is in a role-playing game and what is bad magic?
Well, I think good magic is like whatever that game needs, right? Like for me personally, can I swear on your podcast?
Sure.
No, I do not enjoy the magic missile that always deals. That is like the most boring. I mean,
should be called mundane missile.
Yeah. Oh my god, like it's so unmagical. And I remember thinking that in Pathfinder. I remember thinking, oh well, what do you got? What do you got up your sleeve? Oh, magic missile again. Here we go. What do you like? It just it totally has no mystery or charm, and to me, that's part of what the whole idea of magic is. I totally understand where it comes from, right? There's this desire to codify and apply and create rules that make this integrate with all the other rules you got going on. And if that's the game you want to play and that's enjoyable, then that's great for that game. I realized playing Pathfinder that I didn't enjoy that, and I think part of it came out of the thing that sealed that deal was this magic shield experience I told you about. Like, it's a magic shield. It could do what the characters said it could do, but then there's this other thing where, like, at any point in the story we could say, well, what made it magical? Where did it come from? We could explore that question, and it's a mystery. Like, and maybe the mystery could never be answered, but like, there's this suggestion of it just suggests a lot, right? So for me, good magic is magic that feels. I mean, when you just described the Fraiser quote of those things, like, it's interesting to think of it as a way of manipulating the world, but also a way of understanding the world. Like, it's a way. All three of those things are ways of explaining phenomenon, right? Like magic. Like, why does bad? Why was there no good hunting this year? Because the spirits of the woods. We didn't make the proper offerings to the spirits of the woods or whatever. Like. There's this way of trying to explain these things that we can't, that's really hard for us to grasp. They're ways of understanding, I think. And I think that when you get into the study of early magic, I mean, I don't know how much we can actually study that, but that's part of what's going on. That's my sort of feeling about that, is that it's a way of kind of interpreting and seeing the world, right? You see the world through that lens, or the lens of an almighty God, or the lens of what's under the microscope. So there's that aspect of it. And I think this idea of the mysterious, kind of more chaotic manipulation of these forces, these supernatural forces, certainly comes out of various traditions that talk about the supernatural, the world. And in RPGs, it gets weaponized, right? How can we take these ideas and make them kill monsters? Which is totally interesting to me. But the thing that the DCC RPG kind of showed me was just the idea that it's this crazy force that's not entirely in your control, and if you're somebody who messes with that force, you're going to get messed up.
Right.
Like,
you get a mutation of some kind.
Yeah, it's gonna poison you. And I love that idea of these people who are crazy enough to mess with that, and the whole idea of the adventuring party is so. When you get down to the nitty gritty, is so funny and absurd. Like, not absurd, but like really cool in the way that these guys, they have to be outcasts of some society, because they're risking their lives to go in pursuit of treasure that may or may not be there. Mm-hmm. And then have the wizard be part of that makes complete sense. It's just like a total, nut job who's not only risking their life to go do that thing, but like in the meantime,
my life, right,
with this other stuff that might screw everybody up. Yeah. So I love that. I absolutely love that aspect of it. And that's the thing that the more codified magic rules generally don't have, because they really are trying to like break it down by the numbers.
So yeah, I mean, so like I asked the G plus community, I asked, hey guys, what's your favorite form of Magic and role-playing games? Not a single person said Tread, you know, but the responses I got back said Freebooters, Amber, Maze Rats, Ars Magica, World of Dungeons, Mage the Ascension, Monster of the Week. And so it's all this very like free-forming, free-flowing kind of magic. And I think Rich Rogers even on there said something like, to me, any regimented magic system is a kind of science. So that like builds right back into what we were saying, or what what Fraiser said, where it's like we look at the progression of once you nail down exactly how it works and you fully understand it, it is no longer magic, it is science. And like I always kind of look at it in the way of like, if your mage or your wizard in RPGs can always do this one thing, like cast magic missile, it is no different than just any sort of melee move, right? Ultimately it's just dealing a certain amount of damage. And the only thing that makes it magic is that under the category heading, it says magic, right? So what influenced the way you did the mechanics of magic in Freebooters?
So the primary thing was DCC RPG. I mean, I took a lot of ideas from that. The biggest one is the idea of just magic that you can't fully control, and that may mess you up if you mess too much with it. But then what I did was I'd never, people around the same time were talking a lot about Appendix N stuff, and how one of the things Joseph Goodman did when he wrote the DCC RPG was went back and he read all that stuff and used it as a really looked at the material that the authors of the original Dungeons and Dragons had looked at and reread it and really tried to he went to the primary source to like figure out how to. He was curious to like build out from there. So what I did after I learned that is I went back and I read Jack Vance's Dying Earth stories, which I'd never actually read before, and which are wonderful, which are like, I was so surprised by how much I like them. I was kind of expecting sort of pulpy, relatively poorly written stuff, and it's like really well written. It's really funny. It's really, but the most amazing thing to me is like, it's this fully believable. He doesn't do world building the way like Tolkien, created an entire believable, coherent setting. He just writes in this utterly convincing way that this thing, that is absurd thing that he's describing, is actually happening. Like, he's so committed and to the thing he's describing. For all I know, he was just trying to like meet a deadline and but the guy was a kind of genius, I think, because it's super fun to read, and the way he talks about magic, he doesn't explain it. He doesn't. There's no exposition. It's just like. He just kind of, it's a matter of fact. That's part of what's so convincing about the stories. It's like as if we as readers all know what he's talking about when he talks about these crazy spells. So it was a super fun and inspiring pleasure to go back and read those books. So when it came time to create, and I was thinking about the DCC thing, and the thing that was hard for me about DCC is if I wanted to write my own spell, you have to actually write this whole table. You have to create a whole table of progressive results, because the higher you roll in DCC, the more effective and different your spell is. There's still an incredible amount of variation within those results, but you have to create basically a percentile die table, essentially, for each spell that you make. And I was like, that's just too much work. It's super fun that game exists and I get to play it, but I don't want to make that game. I want to make a game, inspired by the likes of the more, like John Harper's stuff, like Bootleggers and Ghost Lines and his kind of smaller, tighter games. I wanted something that was much more bare bones. So what I did was I went through all the names of all the spells in Jack Vance's book, because I wanted the spells to have that feel. He has this really particular way of the verbs, the adjectives and the nouns that he used was really particular to his writing style. And wizards' names are a big part of that, right? Which is where the names in the D&D spell book. There's some spells that have names, and that totally comes from Jack Vance doing that. So I created the spell name list totally using that as my source material. So I made a list of all the nouns that Vance used and all the adjectives that he used and all the wizard names. And then I broke that down and to see how and then I just added my own to fill in the gaps that felt like they had the same vibe. And then I had this crazy spell generation table. And then, you know, the hardest part is figuring out how to, you do need some kind of mechanical underpinning, or else it's hard to use in play. People don't have the confidence to use it in play unless you give them some kind of mechanical structure.
But when we talk about Vance, I think the thing that comes to mind about role-playing is that idea that, like, you know a spell, you can only cast it so many times and then it's lost. And that's not like, I mean, that's not what's in Freebooters. So how did you, like, come upon, my favorite part about it is that in your system, you have these, like, spell points, right? And then you did a very elegant table of, like, you can spend your point to, like, increase its distance. You can spend your point to increase its damage. You can, you can manipulate the spell. And I think my favorite part of that is that it feels like you have this clay, this, like, ethereal, like, lump of mana, and then you can use it the way you want to, right? One of the things I don't like about trad game spells is, like, if you do fireball, it always deals like 8d6, right? But if you're a master of that spell, you should be able to make it only do like 2d6, or you can increase the distance, or, you know, you can, like, shape it the way you want to. That is what I really enjoy about that system. So did you get that system from something else? Did you totally create it yourself, or, like, where did you get that from?
I think there's stuff out there, I'm sure, that does a similar kind of scaling, because it's not just you have points and you can manipulate it to shape the different parameters of the spell, but as you level up, those points increase. So that light spell that you cast when you're level 1, which would be like, I don't know, Flen's Wings, Gossamer Light, or whatever random spell you might have gotten. At first it could maybe just light up, like the light spell in D&D lights up something, but when you're level 6, you could do a lot more with that light. You could blind people with it. You could interpret it however you want. So I wanted this idea that, like, that magic missile spell, or, you know, the light spell that you get when it's a level 1, or I can't remember, it was a cantrip or what in the original game, but that's can increase in both flexibility and power as you get better at that spell, right? It's like a thing that can improve and can be, you can make it do different things as long as it fits within the title of that spell. So I'm sure that those ideas are out there. I was not consciously modeling on anything. What I wanted was exactly what you're describing, a sense of, I can shape it, you know, within I can work within these words to create a thing, and I can make it do different things. And as I grow up in level, I can make it do more powerful things. Or, as you said, right, scale it down. I could say, I only want it to light up my fingertip.
Right. And, like, in that way, it also builds in kind of more storytelling elements than just, you know, the static of what I know a spell does. Like, you're able to then say, like, I want this spell to, like, this light spell that I have, I want it to deal a bunch of damage. I need it to deal a bunch of damage, but I have to put myself into harm's way to do it, right? Or I could take on the role of being in the back of the party if you're, you know, using a hex crawler or that kind of proximal spacing in your game. I'm going to stay in the back and just kind of, like, nickel and dime this bad guy because I don't want to keep it, right. Like, that's the kind of gameplay that, for me as a DM, like, I want to see people do as a player. That's what I want to do. I don't just want it to be like, well, I know, all right, get your D4s out, because I know the spell always does 4d4 plus 1, right? So, and I always want anything that happens in the game, anytime you roll dice, for it to lead to more story, right? And make something interesting happen. And I think that system, out of all the systems that I looked at and what everyone suggested to me to look at, that they said are their favorites, the system that's in Freebooters, I think, allows for the most narrative and most interesting gameplay through that aspect.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. So unless there's anything else you want to talk about in regards to Magic, or how you came up with that, or any, like, what's your favorite Magic system?
I mean, I think that one, like you said, like, if it's not out there, you write it yourself. I'd still like to, there's still things that need to happen with it. As I've played a number of campaigns and I've seen Magic users grow and change, like, there's still some things I want to work out for second edition to make it work better. But in general, I'm really happy. I love being at the table. I love when people roll up their spells and everybody says, what does that do? And I say, well, we'll find out. the first time you cast it. And different people, different tables I've found, because I'm not explicit about the fact that once you cast it, it does that thing. Anytime you cast it, you can reconfigure it and change what it does. You can make it an offensive spell if it could reasonably be, fit into that title of the spell, or you can make it a defensive or a buff spell depending on how you work with the judge, the GM, to sort that out. Like one of my favorite things is to watch that happen, to watch them figure out. This last game, somebody had this spell called Bright Bolt. It was a super nice, quick title, but you could use that to hit a monster, and just like you said, at first level, you got to get up close to that monster and literally touch it.
Yeah.
If you want it to do a couple dice of damage. Or later on, that same wizard was using it to give a +1 dexterity bonus to one of the other characters. Was using it to buff, and the brightness being this kind of alacrity, like you will shine in this battle. Like, they had this great. I love it when players have to come up with these explanations. And then after they do that and kind of tweak it a couple different ways, they become their kind of go-to things, right? Okay, I basically know how to use this offensively. I basically know how, and then they as players are having a similar experience to the wizard, playing around with these spells, like, oh, this does this, and I can do this. And then they can still get creative as the situation demands, but they do have a little bit of a kind of repertoire that they build up. But the nice thing is they've made that repertoire themselves. And when that can happen in a game, I just love that, when the players have that kind of agency and they have that kind of ownership of that aspect of their character. I just really, really love.
Yeah, it's just another level for them to be invested, because they've created something that's real, that is for their kid. Yeah, I haven't thought of it that way, but yeah, totally. I mean, every time that I've been in a situation where I see people use a spell in a creative way and their face lights up and they get that kind of that little reward for being creative. And then they really internalize that spell as being theirs because they used it in that way. Yeah, cool. Okay.
But then they roll a 6 or less.
Right.
And that bright bolt blinds them for a day.
Right.
You're like, ah.
Right. And that's the other end too, is that also allows us to be creative as GMs on how it's going to go negative for you too. So cool. Right. All right, so on the next segment, I reached out to the G+ community and had them post me some questions for you. So I'm just going to fireball these questions at you.
Okay.
I mean, feel free to just give one sentence answer if it requires, or let's just go. We're going to power through these. Ready?
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yochai Gall asks, how does the wilderness in real life around you, how did that influence your gaming and when you made Perilous Wilds?
I'm lucky enough to live in kind of rural Vermont, and the woods are out my back door, and I often am hiking and walking and thinking a lot about what it would be like to adventure in the wilderness. So being out there in the world makes me excited about natural spaces and imagining what fantasy worlds would be like to actually be in them. So that's kind of what comes right in there. I grew up in the hills of Montana, so I have, the outdoors is a big part of my, has been a big part of my life, and I just was inspired to try to bring that in. And another thing that is true, and there have been, Stanford University did a study about spending time in nature and just walking in general is I'm not sure exactly what how they're measuring this, but there's a 50% increase in creativity after you do something like that. So if you just take literally a 15-minute walk in the woods, after that you'll be more energized and inspired and creative, according to this study. And that's totally something I've experienced in real life. When I spend an enormous amount of time at my drawing table in front of a screen, but when I get out into the world and I go walk in the woods or down by the river and then come back, I feel I've got more ideas than I left the house with. So both of those things, there's a very direct imagining the wilderness and bringing that into a game, and then there's in my actual life that has this direct kind of therapeutic effect on my frame of mind.
Cool. I some of the data I've seen too, same thing. is kind of the same response when it comes to healing. So if like someone is injured and they're in like a hotel, sorry, not a hotel, a hospital room, if their room has a window, the rates of health improvement versus someone who doesn't have a window. So I don't know much about the data in regards to what nature can do for a person, but I believe, you know, like being able to just stretch your legs out, kind of like get your body into a different position, going outside, and the kind of stimulus that being out in the woods could give you. Yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, I think it's huge, and it's something I try to. It's hard to do, but I encourage my students to do it as well. Like to get out, and there's some classes where we get out and just go for a walk and sit in the park and talk out there, and it just is a great way to like switch stuff up for sure.
Cool. All right, Christo, the Tainted Dingo asks, what inspires your drawing or art style?
I grew up reading American Western and superhero comics, but the thing that had the biggest visual impact on me was Hergé, was Tintin, the Tintin comics. He's a Belgian cartoonist who I totally fell in love with as a kid. So people say I have a more European clear line style, and that totally comes from Hergé being a huge influence on me.
Cool. He also asked another question. Do you have any favorite characters or scenarios you like to play most, and why?
Oh my God, no. I want to do different things all the time. Boy, I'm trying to think of what I've actually repeated. My favorite characters are the ones that I come up with on the fly, like the NPCs that just come out of I'll roll a random trait. Somebody will ask me a question, and then some of the funnest characters we had are ones that I or other players have just improvised on the spot.
Do you have any like pet NPCs? Like if you go from group to group, you're like, cognitive load, I've already used this character like 4 times.
No, that totally breaks my rule of every world must be its own.
All right. I mean, I didn't say that. I just gave myself away. Yeah.
I got nothing against that, but that's just not.
Okay. Mark Tigert asks, when is the next 20 dungeon starters coming out?
Mark. Well, Mark has like 60 in his pocket. But I'm not. That's not in the near future, alas. Sorry, Mark. Marshall Miller and Mark Tigert write great dungeon starters, and I put 20 of them together in a book last year and put that out because such a great resource, and I wanted to have them all in one place, sort of formatted the same way. It was one of those things where I wanted that thing, thing, and so I asked them, and we put it together, which was awesome. So yeah, I don't know when the next one's coming out. Sometime possibly in the future. No promises.
Okay. Matteo Casali asks, or he says, I love your comics. Any chance you could do some mix of comics and stories and Dungeon World? Something more like Dungeon Starters kind of comics. And he says, I know it's crazy, I know, but if there is a guy who could do it, it's you. So
geez, it is a cool idea. I have thought about ways to connect those things. I think if I did, I would get somebody else to draw it because it takes me a really long time to make certain comics art in general. Takes me a while. Yeah, I've thought a lot about ways to possibly integrate those things. The biggest issue for me is having the visuals influence the story too much, right? Like, 'cause for me, it's best if it exists in the world of the minds of the players. I did do a thing where we played Fiasco. Some students and I played Fiasco and recorded it, and then we edited it and turned it into a comic book called Bingo Baby a number of years ago. And that was a really fun experiment. And I'm always looking for ways to bring the overlap between games and comics. I think there's a lot of rich territory there. So no plans for anything, but it's good ideas to think about.
Okay. What are the updates concerning Freebooters 2nd edition? Sorry, that question was by Horst Wurst.
Okay. The current playtest material is available online in the Lampblack and Brimstone G+ community. So anybody can just go on there and find the link and download and play. And I'm not going to be able to work on it anymore until January at the earliest. And my hope is sometime in the second half of 2018 to put out the complete 2nd edition, which would be, as I said before, a self-contained thing.
Cool. Michael Prescott asks, what is your philosophy with revenue sharing when working with contributors? And I think the previous to him saying that was he actually asked, why are you so generous with contributors? And I was like, what does that mean? And he said, well, what's your philosophy there?
I make him dinner for Michael every week. I make him dinner and I bring it to him. No, he lives in Toronto and I live here. I got to meet him once, which was awesome. So when I started this whole project, the RPG angle, having done a lot of freelance illustration myself as a working artist, one of the things that's troubling about that world is a lot of times people are underpaid. A lot of times you'll make a piece of art and the thing that it's test you will blow up and make tons of money, and you'll just get that initial $150 that you got paid for it. And as an artist myself, I'm not happy with that dynamic, and it's one that kind of is rife throughout the industry. So I wanted to do an experiment where I would do a profit share with, or revenue share. I don't even know the technical term of what I'm doing, but right now the money I make off of LMB goes back into my gaming budget. Like, it buys my games for myself, and then I pay these contributors, and I make a little bit more after that goes into my actual bank account. It's been a fun experiment, and the greatest thing is, like, I feel really good about giving people more money, at least people who did really great work for me. So so far it's great. It's very satisfying to be able to every 6 months PayPal people some money.
Cool. Okay. So moving on to the next segment here, a segment I called Manifest It, and this is actually using the freebooters. I've never asked you on this. I think I tried to contact you on G+. Do you have any reservations on me using this in my podcast?
Oh God, no.
Okay.
It's so great. I'm totally honored. When I didn't even realize you were doing it until I listened to Joe Banner's interview, and I was like, what? Awesome.
Yeah. So this is at full disclosure. When I originally do this, this is using the Freebooters spell generator on the AdventureSmith app, which is really, both of those things are great. Like, I love this community for stuff just like this. So I sent you these 3 randomly generated spell names that you could use for items, spells, or things, just kind of as an evocative sentence or evocative idea here. So the 3 are Sight Mind of Gale Dread, Thundering Truth, and Excruciating Steam. Do any of those pique your interest?
So, like any good GM, what I did was I turned that question on other people. So when somebody says to me, well, what does the spell Excruciating Steam do? I say, well, what do you think it does, right? And in this case, I turned it on my son and my daughter. So I have answers for all 3 of those. The first one is Excruciating Steam, which was given to me by my daughter Clementine, age 11. You put your hands like this, and then a glittery silver stream comes out of your fingers, and it gathers in a kind of narrow triangle, and it hurls itself at your enemy and gives them a 3rd-degree burn. So that's Excruciating Steam. The next up here is Sight Mind of Gale Dread, which my son Max, age 7, interpreted as an object, a magic item. And he said, it's a pair of kissy lips in a cube of gel, and it kisses you, but then wherever it kisses you, turns purple and turns into diamonds. And wherever you die, there will be a diamond mine right where you died. That's Sight Mind of Gale Dread is great for long-term investment. If you want to leave a diamond mine behind you. I don't know if that has anything to do with Sight Mind, but that was his interpretation. And then the last one, Thundering Truth, is Clementine again, and she says, it's kind of a Wonder Woman thing, but instead of a lasso, it's a lightning bolt. So I guess... if I got struck by lightning, I might tell the truth.
Yeah. It's funny. So I game with my son Atlas, and he's he just turned 4, but I had never thought about asking him what any of these spells might do. I was actually planning on doing a recording of just him and I playing. I don't know if you've ever played with someone so young, but it's
no, man, that's like impressive. That is impressive.
Yeah, like he's working on right now learning on what a cliffhanger is. So he'll always be like, oh, you hear something and you reach into the drawer and cliffhanger. And I'm like, no, dude, you got to tell me. And he's like, nope, not going to tell you. You got to wait till next time. And I'm like, so he's learning that. And so, listening to the way, even just the way your children described these spells. So awesome. Like just the pure joy and imagination that come out of like young gamers is just so awesome.
Playing that, I think you were talking to Ray Otis about that, right? He plays with his kids too. And playing with kids, I have a kind of informal group in the neighborhood that we get together every month or so and do something. And it's just so great because, like you said, they just have no preconceptions and they're just wide open to possibility. And playing, well, sometimes the students I get, if they've never played before, they don't have any expectations either. And those are oftentimes just the funnest players because they just like, I'll do this. And then you have to roll with that and figure out what happens. And it's just pure joy. It's like the funnest thing ever to see them do that and just like, stuff I would never expect and couldn't make up myself.
Right.
Like I would come up with some like, boring, like I would attempt to be kind of literary in my interpretation of these spells, but they just, straight to the diamond mine that's left behind when you die.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. So, I mean, kind of wrapping up here, where can anyone find you?
I don't have a lot of, the main place would be G+. There's the Lampblack and Brimstone community, and then I'm just on there too. And that's really the main thing where I do anything. I'm not on Twitter, and that's pretty much it. Yeah. Oh, and I do have, there's lampblackandbrimstone.com, which is where you can get the books and stuff. And Drive-Thru RPG, there's a publisher page there.
Cool. So, I mean, I'll put links to those in the descriptions, but, I think that's going to be it for the Two Simple Psychs podcast. Jason, thank you so much for stopping by.
My great pleasure, Andrew. Thank you. Oh, I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
What is the significance of the tower in your G+ avatar icon? The clock tower or whatever that is.
Oh, yeah, that's in Spokane.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that is actually, this is kind of weird. I'm glad you asked me, but there's a clock tower that's downtown Spokane. If you ever look at the 7th Sea role-playing game that just came out, if you look on the cover, I swear that's the same tower. So if you just go onto Google, and the only reason why that's on there is because I posted on the 7th Sea website, said, hey guys, I don't know who the artist is, but I swear this is the same tower. If that's true, tell me. And then their Google Plus community isn't that active, so I don't think anyone ever answered me. But that was sitting on my computer, so then I got tired of seeing just that default face that's on your thing. So I just put that picture. So it's actually not that significant.
Hey, it's Spokane. That's it's where you're at. It's a place mark.
Yeah. Awesome. Right. But thanks for asking. For listeners then, if you like what you heard, and you can find interviews like this and more at the Psychology of Gaming website. Thank you for listening.